views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. There are so many issues surrounding the pandemic, and you know this, we've talked about it just about every week. You can't get to all of them, but then what happens is things get prioritized because of the immediacy of trying to deal with the pandemic. And so, you start with healthcare, and then you go to economic development and how we're going to reopen, and then the schools. And unfortunately, what was probably the biggest issue 4 years ago has now moved down somebody's priority list, but on other people's list, it's pretty much still near the top. And I'm referring to immigration. Remember the dialogue over build the wall? That was like the biggest thing 4 years ago. And the whole notion of immigration has slipped out of the limelight, but that doesn't mean, especially in our diverse borough of the Bronx, it is not still a very, very important issue. And so this evening, we thought we'd check in with a couple of experts who really understand the issue, who can, frankly, bring it home to us here in the Bronx. And we're going to go through all the things, whether it be a wall, whether it be legislation, whether it be conditions. Let's find out how immigrants and undocumented might be doing. And we haven't done this in a while on the program, so we thought we would do that this evening. My pleasure to welcome the New York Immigration Director for Forward.us. It is Eddie Taveras. Nice to have you with us, Mr. Taveras.
Thank you for having me.
And also the Executive Director of Immigrant Advocates Response Collaborative. It's easy to say IARC, and that is Camille Mackler. Ms. Mackler, nice to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Eddie Taveras, gee, those days of build the wall 4 years ago. Let's talk about from that perspective. Where were we 4 years ago? The wall has been a little constructed. And where are we now looking 4 years later after the Trump presidency?
Yeah, I mean, we were at a time where, the world was changing politically and ideologically. And, America was no different than that. As we saw the trend, coming from Europe, it hit us hard. And we had it in, a campaign that started on the racist and xenophobic perception of immigrants, and so that's sort of where we started, and we headed into, an administration that was very anti-immigrant. It started this symbolic sort of appeal to certain sectors of the electorate on this sort of separation and exclusionism of America. And, years later, we know that hasn't worked. We know that Trump's policy and his administration policy and value deficit policy have created a crisis at the border, had really exacerbated our immigration and broken immigration system that already needed, some fixing for some time. I believe the last time it was we actually reformed anything on immigration was almost 30 years ago. So it hasn't kept up with today's society, with Americans' economic and social needs. And so that's why we are here today. And, luckily, we are going into a new administration, and we're hopeful that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris really takes up on their campaign promise to really put forward a legislation that is comprehensive and allows for a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people here.
I like the fact that you said it hasn't worked, but there are many people who say it's begun to work because immigration is down. Now we know diversity is up throughout the country. And I don't, especially now, we don't travel a lot. But when you move around a America, you can go to small towns and you'll find it is immigrants who are owning the stores and running the stores, and you see them all over. The country is ever more diverse than it ever was before. So it maybe for some people it is working. You may not agree with that. What's your point of view about that?
I mean, that's an interesting perspective. What we know is, America's innovation and economy drives and is propelled by immigrants. So when people are saying it's not working, it's because we have become not a sort of viable, country to come into. People are afraid to now come into, to study here, to bring jobs here, to bring innovations. When we look at Fortune 500 companies, we're looking at, a lot of them led by either first generation immigrant children or immigrants themselves. So we're going to start to see that trickle down effect of the devastation that this administration have put in America, and sort of the destruction of the American dream, where anybody can come here, no matter what part of the world, what your socioeconomic, status is, and can make it here. And so that is sort of the consequences of this. And I think we shouldn't also, put that framework in, because people are still crossing the border, right? What this administration is doing is just making it more dangerous. What this administration doing is closing legal pathways for people to come here and illegalizing people as they come here. And so that's sort of the framework that that needs to be really looked into and really accepted, but because it is supported by the data.
I want to bring Ms. Mackler in, but I want to leave this in your mind because we're going to get back to you about it. The way it's been presented is like all or nothing. They want open borders. They want to just let them stream in. And I'm going to get back to you in just a little bit, Mr. Taveras, about, what would be a good policy. But I want to bring Ms. Mackler in, and let's talk about conditions right now. This is a very difficult, fraught time in American history and world history. How has the pandemic affected immigrant populations in the United States? Clearly, people of color have been affected by the pandemic more than others. But is there a palatable vision of that, well, wait a minute, we ought to look at immigrants directly in the context of the COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't agree with Eddie more on everything he said as usual, but
that would be no surprise.
Right. No, but really, I think honing in on this idea that America is going to lose out if we don't invest economically and socially in immigrant communities is true. And the pandemic has actually really is a perfect example of that. I mean, immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, have been left out of a lot of relief programs. Even as, we've seen, and I think there was an article even just this morning, right, that those communities of color, lower income communities, which also tend to be a lot of immigrant communities, are certainly dying at higher rates, getting sick at higher rates. And the reason for that really is, the access to healthcare issues, the fact that immigrants are doing the frontline jobs, and not just, here in New York City, right? We see them, they're delivering our food, they're cleaning the hallways of the hospitals, they're the cab drivers, they're working in the hospitality industry, but they're also on the farms. They're an integral part of our food chain, of our food supply chain. And the farms upstate we've seen have had huge outbreaks because of the conditions in which immigrants live and in which workers interact in these workspaces. And at the same time, they've struggled not just with the fact that they don't have access to the relief packages. Undocumented immigrants did not get anything under the CARES Act. The city and the state did not provide any sort of financial assistance or any kind of support, but also just putting it back into the context of the last 4 years of this administration and the attacks and the sort of sense of unwelcome that this administration has promoted and frankly been extremely, extremely effective at, right? I mean, if there's one thing that the Trump administration has succeeded on, it's its anti-immigrant agenda. And that has created a sense of fear and of unwelcome. That means that immigrants are, and those who live in those communities and their supporters are less likely to seek medical help. There was a lot of concern because at the same time as the pandemic was rolling out and the city and the state were, trying to get as many people as possible to get tested, to get, treated when necessary, immigrants were also by the same time being told by the Trump administration that any public benefit might put them at risk of deportation, certainly would make them ineligible for green cards. But when that news gets translated into sort of like everyday speak, this puts you at risk of immigration enforcement. And so we saw immigrants afraid of accessing healthcare, afraid of accessing benefits they were entitled to. And that's really because of the pervasive culture of fear that has been cultivated and of unwelcome over the last 4 years.
Let's put this right on the table. There are many people who say, you know what, if you're undocumented, you shouldn't have come to this country. You shouldn't have come here illegally. You should have come in legally. And therefore, we don't want to spend, especially now, our precious healthcare resources and other benefits. We don't want to extend those to those people. And basically what you hear all the time is come here legally, do what I did, or do what maybe my family did, or whatever it is, and then you can participate and get the benefits that we get for being American citizens. What's your response to that? Because there is tremendous, and it really is the foundation on some levels, the pushback against a lot of the things that you're saying. They take our jobs. They take other resources.
Yeah, but Gary, I think that really goes into this sort of misconception that the immigration debate is a very black and white debate, when in fact it is incredibly nuanced. And I don't really subscribe to the idea that 73 million Americans, who were originally all immigrants, by the way, but I don't subscribe to the idea that 73 million Americans all take that line, and that it's certainly not that they would take that position if they understood the nuances. And I base that on my own experiences. I mean, I represent a statewide organization. Eddie represents a national organization. We've both traveled extensively right outside of our bubble of New York City and spoken to Americans about immigration. And yes, I have walked into rooms where people found out I was an immigration advocate and started screaming, build the wall at me. But when we actually got into a conversation about how did they come here? Maybe there's no line. Maybe there is a line. They stood in it. It didn't work for them. Maybe they were failed by the system. And these are just like 3 talking points off the top of my head, but there's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of back and forth. And ultimately what we need to get to is a rational conversation on immigration. The benefits of immigration, which as Eddie pointed out, are very well established. I mean, upstate New York is devastated by the last 4 years of immigration policies. They're reversing years of economic gain to the point that they are trying to attract refugees who initially resettled in other states to get them to come to New York because of the lowering of the refugee numbers, as one example. And I think that this past administration not only was incredibly harmful in terms of their immigration policies and very short-sighted in terms of their outlooks for future economic prosperity for this country and global positioning for this country, but they also really impeded dialogue, just plain old-fashioned conversation around the non-existent this year.
And you're saying that's the case because they look at it as black and white. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can understand. I'm going to partially answer my own question. When I talked about, we came here, et cetera, I know that the people who preceded me to this country came here as undocumented, and they, went through quite a process. I can tell you a story of a cousin who snuck across the Canadian border at that time, and not to say necessarily it was right or wrong, but look at my family, and we're citizens, we're productive. So I'm answering my own question. Eddie, let's have you address the question I addressed, and then we'll get back to you on some of that other stuff.
Yeah, as Camille said, immigration, this whole immigration system and the laws that keep it going, it's very nuanced and it's very complex. But let's not kid ourselves. The Trump administration tried to block 90% of the legal pathways to come here, right? And so that, on top of already a system that was barely functioning, really put us where we are at today. And so the narrative is that if you open more pathways, if you ensure that the laws reflect the current status of America and our community, we wouldn't be in this situation as we are today. I travel this state, so going to North Country, Central, Western New York, I hear of people of all backgrounds and ideology come up to me and say, send me people, right? Our community.
What do you mean by send me people?
Well, the idea that, the population is declining. And so they don't have the workforce, they don't have the community, the cultural, sustainability that requires for communities to come together. And so when looking at Buffalo, it was declining in population and economically. And then you started seeing refugees, asylees, and immigrants move in. And then it started going into an upward trajectory, prior to the pandemic coming in. And so that's not just the story of Buffalo, New York. That's the story of all across America, right? Where we are, America's fabric and America's innovation is dependent on this, migration avenues that allowed, your family, Gary, my family, and Camille's family to be here today. And so that's sort of where we need to get back into is what do we need and what laws do we need to put in place to ensure that our communities are growing and being sustainable. And one way is to, fix our federal immigration system.
You told me before the show that there's something New York State can do, so I'm going to lay out this roadmap, so to speak. The whole notion of, and just using, let's say, my own ancestors as an example, they came in and they knew what they would have to do to become citizens. And the moment that they became citizens was, of course, wonderful. Everybody was excited. They had big parties, et cetera, et cetera. That question of the path to citizenship, the roadmap to citizenship, is highly questionable right now. So it's, I guess, a two-part question. Number one, what do we need to do to create a path so that everybody understands it? And then number two, what can New York State do specifically to partner in this effort?
Yeah, when it comes to federal, the federal government is the only one, and Congress is the only one that can address the legalization of individuals. And so what we need to do is making sure that we are focused on a human first sort of perspective, and not just an economic perspective, and making sure that when we're opening pathways that it includes from students who come here to research and we want to attain that talent and that work that they put here, to companies and individuals who want to contribute economically, but to cultural, people who are artists and are coming here and bringing, their genius and their diversity here. But to make sure that there's avenues for people to come here. Not everybody wants to come here and stay, permanently. Some people want to just come here to work. Some people just want to come here temporarily. When we talk about agriculture, work,
go to school, they come to go to college and become important parts of college communities.
Yeah, and what better ways to have ambassadors of world people who come here and take a look at our culture and then take it back, right? The diversity and richness of the communities that we have, and take it back to their home country. And so when we're also looking at agriculture, that's something the Trump administration has targeted and cut. And so even farmers are having issues with filling those type of seasonal workers that they haven't had before under both a Democratic or Republican administration. And so getting to the question at what states can do, states can be proactive to make sure that all their residents in the states have the opportunity and the resources and the mobility to live a fulfilled life, right? Last year we were able to pass the green light law, which allowed undocumented immigrants to obtain driver's license, but making sure that communities are safe by, signing the Protect Our Ports Act, which passed the legislative chambers this year and is just waiting for the government to sign, from the Empire Licensing Act, to make sure that undocumented people or anybody, regardless of status, can obtain occupational and certification for different occupation, right? And so when we're looking at this pandemic world that we're living in, we want to make sure that those avenues of economic opportunities are open, because our community depends on it and our economic prosperity depends on it.
There are 11 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States who don't have a pathway to citizenship. Ms. Mackler, let's talk about Daca and the threats to Daca that have done this all year long about, well, now it's not going to work, and now it's going to work. And, we've gone around the table a few times on that. Let's talk about conditions. What are undocumented immigrants thinking now? Some have already left the country, we know that. And where are we at as far as a path? And then I'd even ask you to recommend a path to citizenship that would work and be fair
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't want to pretend to speak for, the millions of Daca recipients, much less the 11 million undocumented immigrants. Generally, I think Daca has been a source of specific and particular heartbreak. I mean, just the Band-Aid solution that Daca was intended to be when President Obama created the program, and then just the absolute roller coaster of emotions. And we've heard of just the devastating impact on Daca recipients and their family members. I mean, just from a mental health perspective, honestly, the roller coaster that it's here, it's not here, it's here, it's you're going to be deported.
That's what I did the little roller coaster for you.
It was tremendously devastating, I think, is really the only word that I can think of. In terms of where we go from here, I mean, there's been legislation that's been passed, right? The House passed the Dreams and Promise Act, I want to say about a year ago. Obviously would have to be reintroduced at this point. And that was to help put DACA recipients as well as temporary protected status holders, which is a separate program that the Trump administration interfered with to the point of essentially ending for most, would put all of those individuals who've lived here and contributed here for a very long time on a path to citizenship. I do hope that we get away from sort of as we think about how do we rebuild. It's, the last 4 years have been devastating for immigrant communities, but they certainly exacerbated flaws, which is, to put it very mildly, that existed long before that. And I hope that we start talking, far more holistically about, comprehensive reform to the system that puts everyone on a path to citizenship, or at least on a path to stability and to welcome. And, I think we've seen historically that laws that have addressed enforcement only without having a comparable expansion of legal avenues for immigration have actually led us, into the situation that we're in today. I mean, in the late 80s, you had President Reagan pass legalizations that, purported to take, to help put the vast majority of, at the time, undocumented immigrants onto a path to legalization, which was about 3 million at the time. And then 10 years later, President Clinton signs what is at this point the latest largest reform to the immigration laws, which really criminalized immigration, made it much more punitive, restricted pathways to legal immigration, restricted pathways to asylum. And here we are with, I think today, I think you're right, just shy of 11 million undocumented immigrants. But, right before the economic crisis in 2007, we were at an all-time peak of 12 million. So we need to think about this. We need to be smart. We need to be inclusive. We need to be welcoming, and we need to be, we need to be all-encompassing.
What is a path that would work? Are you talking about be in this country for 3 years, show some economic stability, certainly knowledge? I mean, there's always these little history tests, so you understand a little bit about, American history and American democracy. What would be a path? I mean, both of you have talked about a path. What would you recommend? And then we'll certainly let Mr. Taveras weigh in on that as well.
So, yeah, and I think, I'd love to hear what Eddie says, but I think the answer to that question is we haven't had a chance to really think through what the answer to that question is. I think one thing we learned from this summer and, the protests after the George Floyd murder and just the bigger question around racial equality and inclusiveness in this country really taught us a lesson that that's an answer that needs to come with the communities that are affected, consulted and being a large part of that process. I think going back to 2013, which is the last attempt that we had at a sort of bipartisan approach to it, we saw a lot of a push towards sort of a more points-based system, a merits-based system where you sort of, depending on your level of education, your language abilities, your, I can't remember all the details, but sort of modeled on Canada, right? Where that was a pathway to legal immigration. And then there was some other humanitarian grounds. There was also in that bill, if I remember correctly, provisions to address the backlogs of some family members are waiting 15, 20 years to have a green card application actually adjudicated. I mean, the system
it's one thing to say, well, we haven't gotten there yet, but to be part of this country and those people are likely working and doing the jobs frankly, that Mr. Taveras recommended, that say, well, wait a minute, we need them to be part of it. And to wait 15 to 20 years, that's ridiculous. Sorry, I had to say.
No, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I completely agree. But so I think that it's a bigger process. I do think we need to think about it, in a much larger framework at this point, and think about what our goals are to create a system that is welcoming, that meets our economic needs, and that is also, really rectifies a lot of racial inequity of the system for the last 200 years before it. So it's a big task.
All right. Well, we announced, we heard the announcement yesterday in his transition that Eddie Taveras is going to be the czar of immigration for the United States of America. And we want to know his opinions on what sort of path would be a reasonable path, or what qualifications would make you comfortable that somebody would need to achieve in order to achieve citizenship that we haven't had in place for a number of years.
Gary, that's very kind of you.
I support
Would that I had the power to do that, but that's another story.
I support the move.
Yeah, I mean, much of what Camille said, we can't just go into, reforming a system and immediately putting barriers, right? What we know is for the last 30 years or so, since the last big immigration reform came to Congress, was passed, is that these type of barriers and type of limitations don't actually fix anything, right? And so we really need to, going back to, again, what Camille said, really talk to community members, really talk to the directly impacted people, and, talk to people across the board. And I think what we consistently been hearing is that we want something that works for, the 21st century. We want something that is humane. We want something that is really driven by, the family, system and operation of like what makes us, who we are today in society. And so that putting these type of barriers, I think, and going into it, I think it could put us back in a very tricky situation in a pathway to not solving anything. And I think when we're looking at why we're asking for a pathway for the 11 million, it's because we've tried everything else. We have literally tried from enforcement to small little symbolic reform.
So if I can just understand what both of you are saying is, let's get representatives from each sort of immigrant population, whether it be geographical or different levels of entry into the country, and find out what they think would be fair and proper. That would be your solution. Is got about a minute. And we could spend all night on this particular subject. What do you hear from the border? So maybe Eddie, if you could spend just a little bit, children are separated. We can't find their families. Who knows what will become of them? You got 30 seconds, and then Camille will ask you the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, what we heard is a actual, man-made problem, a humanitarian crisis from the border, and so what with the new administration coming in, and we are hoping that they prioritize making sure that we open back the border for asylum seekers to come here, which is a legal right of them to come here and seek that protection. And I think most importantly, which we've heard recently in the last few weeks, is to reunite the 666 children that have been separated from their family from the last.
I'm going to cut you off because we're out of time, but I don't know how we're going to do that. To be honest, it upsets me greatly. I just can't even imagine. Camille will give you just the final word. Did you want to echo what Eddie said about what we need to do at the border?
I think it's just important to understand that we've created refugee camps at the border. We've created a humanitarian disaster. I think there are programs, the Central American Minor Parole Program, that could be used to model to reunite parents who've been separated from their children as one example. But we need to address the deep humanitarian crisis that we've created, that this government has created at the U.S.-Mexico border. And that,
I think one of the things that just comes up is the word humane. We've got to be humane about what we do, and let's start there. And that would kind of be nice. Listen, we got a lot of work to do on this subject, and from the New York Immigration Coalition Forward.us, Eddie Taveras, thank you so much. And also from Immigrant Advocates Response Collaborative, Camille Mackler, thank you so much. We'll make sure your contact info is on the screen. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Powell. And I think next week we're going to deal with foreclosures. You think we don't have problems? Anyway, it's always good. Stay safe in the Bronx, and we'll see you next week. Good night.